let's talk about some of the important ideas from 2020. Welcome to the Hub for Important Ideas. I'm Steve James.
And I'm Ken Swain. In this episode, we sum up our first season and recall some of the seminal ideas from our guests. Some of these ideas are our favorites. In other words, we just like them. Others are too important not to include. We want to bring into public discourse the most inspiring ideas we've got in an attempt to find the best way forward for humanity.
We're going to play for you some clips from the episodes in our first season. If you've been listening all year, think of this as a recap to a year that was tough but wasn't all bad. If you came in late, here's an opportunity to hear some of the things you missed. If something strikes a chord, you might want to pull up the full episode and hear the whole conversation. Or you can just think of these as the Cliff's Notes version.
Right. Okay, so let's start with Merlin Mowry in Episode 3 on the subject of illusion and death denial.
Becker's ideas about the power of death anxiety do confront us with some of the worst things about human nature. But there's a very powerful sense of satisfaction in coming to understand ourselves more clearly, or getting an idea that helps us explain mysterious things about human beings and human behavior. You're right in terms of people shying away from disturbing and upsetting topics. We all like good news better than bad news. But I'll tell you, when I'm sitting in the doctor's office, I would rather have a troubling but accurate diagnosis than some feel-good evasion.
So, Ken, why are we starting with this one?
Well, Steve, I think what Merlin calls a sense of satisfaction in coming to understand ourselves and human behavior is what we've been striving for a long time. It's really what this podcast series is about.
I agree. And I've always admired Merlin's courage in framing her position this way. Ernest Becker gets a lot of flack for sounding pessimistic. Well, for being pessimistic, I guess. But Merlin is never afraid of bad news. She's all about helping to explain mysterious things about human beings.
Yep.
Let's go to Episode 2. Sheldon Solomon talking about the source of bigotry.
If you grant, either implicitly or explicitly, the legitimacy of an alternative conception of reality, you do so by necessarily undermining the confidence with which you subscribe to your own point of view. And once that happens, you expose yourself to the very anxiety that those beliefs were forged originally to help you resolve somehow.
Steve, why is this idea important?
Well, this is a seminal idea for us, for Ernest Becker enthusiasts, and for terror management theory. It's at the heart of our understanding of bigotry and xenophobia.
Here's a clip from Episode 5, featuring Jerry Piven on war, violence, and evil, 3 of his favorite topics.
Yeah.
That throughout history, so much of what has been done that we consider evil, the horrific violence, has been done to eradicate evil.
Short and to the point.
It's an extremely powerful idea. We commit acts of evil when trying to eradicate evil.
Yeah, it's another way to say it is most evil is done by people who believe they are doing good. It explains so much of human history. Here's a clip from Episode 8 with Kirby Farrell talking about heroism.
Heroism and value are not so much the heroic strutting of a hero in a white hat, but in fact, an admiration of grace and beauty and communication and empathy, the ability to see how other people must be feeling and thinking, and therefore to try to find language that can bring them into some common shared experience with you.
Heroism, as Kirby puts it here, is a social psychological term that describes a way that a culture rewards its members with opportunities for self-esteem and defense against death anxiety. Kirby describes his idea of a hero in our culture.
And it's a beautiful description, too. Next, we have Merlin again, this time from Episode 10, and she's talking about religion.
In recent generations, we've gone in the direction of a kind of feel-good religion, a religion that gives us a feeling of joy and pleasure and eliminates our stress and reassures us. But if you go back to the sacred texts of most religions, they speak pretty bluntly about the fallenness of human nature, about our brokenness, our smallness in the universe, the vanity of most of our efforts. The kinds of ideas that Becker brings to the subject of religion are really very similar to the ideas religious believers and religious thinkers bring to the topic when they are trying to look through a religious lens at human nature.
This is a theme that we get to again later in the year, the ancient view of human nature that has humility at its core. It's at the heart of most, if not all, of the great world religions and in the ancient philosophies.
Yeah, I had to rethink some things this year.
Yeah, me too.
You know me, I didn't trust any notions older than Darwin. But I've started coming around to this way of thinking, that the wisdom of the ancients may have value in our screwed up century.
Yep.
So here we have a clip from Jamie Goldenberg in episode 11, who is talking about sex and the body.
We're different from other animals in that we are more cognitively sophisticated. And among other things, what this does is it renders us aware of the fact that inevitably we're going to die. But rather than be paralyzed with anxiety associated with this, what Becker suggests is that we deal with this threat by clinging to some kind of symbolic cultural worldview in which our own existence can be perceived as meaningful and our own behavior can be perceived as valuable. And so essentially what the civilizing process does is it forces us to change our own animal, natural sense of self-worth for a contrived symbolic one. If the solution to the fears associated with death are to live our lives on this symbolic, abstract plane, well, then the body threatens the efficacy of these mechanisms. The body reminds us that we're animals nonetheless. And so we can try as hard as we'd like to pretend we're these symbolic creatures, but the body every time reminds us, takes us back to the basics and reminds us that we're just animals. Sex, what it does is it reminds us of our animalistic nature. And so even though it's very wonderful, it's also threatening. It also reminds us of the fact that we're like an animal, and being like an animal reminds us that inevitably we're going to die.
I know this is a longer clip. Sorry, but some of these ideas are brief and profound, while others are too complex to fit on a bumper sticker. This idea presented by Jamie is a longish syllogism. Let's see if I can set it up in a simple way. 1, all animals die. I don't want to die. Therefore, I don't want to be an animal. Sex is an animalistic activity, but I like sex, therefore sex is a problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I thought sex was complicated enough before I knew any of this stuff. But now it's really much more complicated. This explains why almost all cultures regulate sex, and why our culture is so confusing in our obsession with sex.
And it brings up some ideas that we get to later.
Right. Okay, here's another Jamie, Jamie Arndt, talking about money and stuff in episode 13.
What does money communicate to us? It tells us not just how much our car is worth, but how much we are worth as the person who holds the keys. And so it becomes in this way a reflection of our sense of symbolic value. So in the same way that we value money because it can buy stuff, it can buy stuff also because we put so much value into it. When we have these symbolic reflections that says, look, I've made it in this world, I've attained a significant amount of material success, that makes us, and that conveys, in this culture at least, that we're people of value, that we're special. And so to the extent that that gives us a reflection in which we can feel good about ourselves, and to the extent that feeling good about ourselves provides protection from deeply rooted existential fears, then we can understand this urge to splurge, this press for materialistic desire as a response in part to efforts to manage these deeply rooted concerns about death and vulnerability. To the extent that this consumeristic utopia, these messages of mass consumption and materialism, to the extent that they become integrated at the individual level, the individual, buys into them, as it were, as a means to attain self-esteem, we can then understand, in part, people's very, very powerful drive to acquire more. Think of Mary Poppins, enough is as good as a feast. And unfortunately, that very sensible notion is not something that many Americans live by. We're driven for more, and we can begin to understand why we're driven for more if we recognize that it's fulfilling a very powerful need that people have to feel good about themselves. To what extent does a cultural system do a few things? To what extent does it provide for the psychological needs of its members? To what extent does it give those people in the culture a sense of meaning and the possibility for a sense of value? And to what extent does it do that while minimizing the costs for those outside the cultural system and for future generations? Americans enjoy some of the highest rates of depression across the world and other forms of mental illness. To what extent is everybody getting access to this as a viable system of meaning?
So, Steve, we're into longer clips now.
Tough.
Yeah, I guess. It's our show. If we want to play long clips, we'll play long clips.
Yep.
So this is a vital explanation of why money and materialism is at the center of our culture and how our materialistic culture fails the average member as a viable system of meaning, a foundational idea.
Right. So back to Jamie Goldenberg again. Here she is in episode 22 in a conversation about misogyny.
We defend against concerns associated with our mortality through our symbolic cultural worldview and self-esteem. And in a sense, this raises us above the level of a mere animal. So things that remind us of the fact that we are an animal nonetheless are threatening to us. And so we seem very much motivated to distance ourselves from all reminders of our connection to other animals. Culture provides the prescriptions and the standards and the rules that we follow. And by doing this, we can, again, separate ourselves from other animals, and we become more of like cultural objects, cultural symbols. We see all over the media images of how the body, the body is our physical body is something that reminds us of the fact that we're like animals. And so we see all sorts of prescriptions for how the body is supposed to look, how it's supposed to behave, how it's supposed to perform. And so by doing this, by having this body that looks a certain way, well, then the body is no longer something that's an animal-like. It becomes more of an object, a cultural object, an object of beauty. In the research that I've been doing, what we argue is that existential factors also play a role. And when we think about, the aspects of women that are devalued, there are all those aspects that tie her to her physical nature. I mean, women are devalued for being less rational than men, more emotional, physically weaker, at the mercy of their bodies. Men are also threatened by these types of attributions about women because men don't merely need women, but they desire women. They're attracted to women. And so they're threatened on some level by thinking of a woman as an animal. So they do it for themselves to strip them of their creatureliness. The root of the need to put women down and also to lift them to a higher level are existential.
You can see how this is at the center of the Me Too movement, the devaluing of women for existential reasons, affecting both men and women in their symbolic cultural defense against death anxiety. This is a Beckerian insight brought into the 21st century by women social psychologist researchers. Powerful ideas that women everywhere could benefit from.
All right. Now we get into even more complex ideas. Again, ones that won't fit.
Oh, boy.
Okay. Ones that won't fit on a bumper sticker. Here's Sheldon Solomon in episode 19 in a conversation about narcissism and economic inequality.
If everybody around you is in fairly similar straits, you're fine. But you're not fine in most cosmopolitan cities where you have shanty towns next to Trump Towers. then what you find, and this is empirical fact, you cannot wish this away, and that is that people are more miserable when inequality goes up to a certain point. They become more cynical, and they have less trust in government to provide for the common good. And it's a physical nightmare that everything from cardiovascular problems to cancer rates to all forms of psychological disorders.
This is Wilkinson and Pickett.
It is.
The spirit level.
That's correct. And so we know that people are physically and psychologically miserable in these conditions. Traditionally, we reduce death anxiety by embracing our cultural worldview and striving for self-esteem. But once we do that, that inclines us to hate people who are different and to blow ourselves up to hypercosmic proportions, at which point we're on the edge of malignant narcissism. And so the claim psychodynamically is that humility and gratitude give you the upside, which is the mitigation of existential terror, without the downside. And it's a pretty powerful psychological cocktail that has the benefit of being affirmed by thousands of years of cross-cultural religious traditions that all converge on the same point. Whereas the point about humility is it's actually a realistic recognition of what I've been calling right now radical insignificance. And
I like that. Radical insignificance.
But what we're saying is that, first of all, that happens to be true. Secondly, that takes all the pressure off. If I'm radically insignificant, then it doesn't matter much if I write a book today or walk the dog. Each of those things can be just as joyous and, frankly, just as ultimately productive a contribution to the life force. About where are we and what next? And I see no viable what next that doesn't include a focus on gratitude and humility. And I say that in part because the other way is unsustainable.
We've gone as far as we can with self-esteem.
Yeah, because it's still based on unlimited growth. It's still ultimately, it's unsustainable. If you're humble and grateful, then you're going to be kind and compassionate. You're going to have a more tender view of life. When we look at ancient rituals, that they're marked by festivity, but not in the frivolous, I'm going to get wasted and puke in the sink, as the ultimate celebration of life. Humility, gratitude, tenderness, festivity are the ultimate expressions of strength and security. They're not the purview of the weak and the meek.
Up till now, we've been following a traditional Ernest Becker line of thought based on his major works and terror management theory, which is based on his theories as developed by Sheldon Solomon and his cohorts. This episode, and the two preceding it, begin to get away from Ernest Becker. We're still following the notion of defending against death anxiety, but now we're looking beyond Becker's explanation of self-esteem and heroism as the primary defenses.
And that's because of the problem in our culture with narcissism.
Right. That's where we started this line of thought, and Sheldon is where we wound up. Humility and gratitude offer an equally strong defense against death anxiety without inclining us to narcissism, which has reached epidemic proportions in our society, unfortunately.
And also because Becker takes you to a place that many readers rebel against.
Yeah, that's true.
It's kind of tough going. Not a lot of people want to go there.
Yep.
Okay, so here's Dan Lichty in episode 23 in Conversations about Humility and Gratitude and Unifying Our Society.
We are a species that is mortal, like every other species. Like every other species, we have the strong desire, instinct, even if you want to call it that, to keep living. But we are, as far as we know, the only species that has the intelligence to recognize that we are ultimately doomed, that we ultimately die. And furthermore, we know that it could happen at any time. We now have a hero system, a cultural system that pushes us towards making our own individual mark. And that means harboring the burden of meaning and mortality and meaning on our own individual shoulders. If you think about what humility and gratitude do to us psychologically, they sort of remind us to tuck ourselves back into that larger whole.
Yeah.
When you feel gratitude, you're basically saying, in a sense, I didn't do anything to deserve this. Ultimately, the meaning of my life doesn't land only on me. I'm simply the manifestation of someone else's beneficence. When you feel humility, when you practice humility, I don't just mean, walking down the street and, let me feel humble for a while. No, I'm talking about when you carry on a disciplined practice to feel yourself humble and feel yourself in gratitude towards that which is beyond you, you're in a sense learning to step back from the end of the diving board, so to speak, of individualism.
Never thought of it that way. I love this. I love this. Yeah, this
back into the meaning, back into the arms of the crowd, because that's ultimately all we can do. We can only hold each other up. In our culture, we have the threads for a more collective, more communal way of keeping our self-esteem alive and so forth. We have those threads, but there are even stronger elements in the culture that push us to not employ those threads, but rather to employ the threads of making your mark individually and so forth. That if you meet someone who you see is really striving, they recognize the cultivation of attitudes of humility and gratitude are really what they need to recapture the mental health that our society, our individualist society, tries to rob from us. You're going to find many, I would say most of the time, but much of the time, those people are people that are immersing themselves in ideas from other cultures, in ideas from our own culture, but from hundreds of years ago, when we weren't quite so pushed to individualism. Those are people that recognize the wisdom of the ancients. When I say people who are consciously trying to cultivate within themselves a growing sense of humility and gratitude, those are going to be people that find it quite natural to be immersing themselves in ideas and writings and practices that come down from the ancients. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about religious practices. And what's your reason for being? What is it that gives your life meaning? What is it that when you feel those times of fear and, those times when you all of a sudden are confronted with your mortality and it springs into your consciousness and you sit there shaking, what is it that really can assure you that no, your life is valuable, your life is meaningful, and what you need to do is live it out? Well, that's the whole thing about know and love and serve God through knowing, loving, and serving other people, I think. I mean, there's no other way to do it. I think we're coming around to more and more people recognizing that if we only are pushing that individualistic achievement stuff, we're kind of reaching a dead end.
Yeah.
Because, you can take almost any topic, ecology, education, the economy, anything like that, and show how this idea that we have no common responsibility, that is responsibility to the collective, that our only responsibility is to keep pushing number one, that's really ultimately really destructive, very destructive. The way that our economy is set up, we take care of ourselves by taking away from other people for the most part.
Unfortunately.
By grabbing as much as we can. And so we end up with people that have much more than they will ever, ever, ever be able to consume or enjoy in any kind of realistic, sensible meaning of the term, and other people who are really on the edge. And that's just our society, not even talking about the world and comparisons of rich and poor in the world. And so we really have come to the point where the bankruptcy of only emphasizing those threads of the culture and saying, build your life on those threads alone, the bankruptcy of that is just becoming evident across the board. When self-esteem inches over into self-aggrandizement, that the only way you can maintain self-esteem is through constant aggrandizing of yourself, of the self, then that becomes destructive. We have another side of our culture too. And so when you recognize that way overemphasis on that side that pushes you towards personal achievement, personal aggrandizement, personal individualism has hit a wall, then the only thing you can do is come back and say, well, okay, what else is there? Well, now then you're able to see there's this whole other side of things that goes way back hundreds of years, thousands of years into the more collectivist, where we see ourselves less as such an isolated individual and much more as part of a larger whole. And then the question is, well, how do we get from there to here? And I see cultivation, and that means conscious practicing in whatever way you do it, conscious practicing that build up your sense of humility and gratitude as the mechanism, as the steps by which we can get from there back to here. Humility and gratitude are not the goal. They're the way toward the goal. The goal is just being able to live a good life, and a life in which we feel that we would want to live it over and over again.
Right.
It's not the goal, it's the way. Our culture is based on the idea of infinitely expanding consumption.
Right.
And that's killing us.
Yeah.
We have to learn how to feel good about ourselves at a much lower level of consumption of material goods than we currently do. I'm still growing into a life of humility and gratitude, but I'm finding that life is much more a life worth living and enjoyable. Don't think about saving humanity. Let's just think about turning the worst parts of our culture backwards a little bit.
A lot to unpack, as they say.
Boy, I'll agree with that.
In our 21st century American culture, we defend against death anxiety on our own through self-aggrandizement. Humility and gratitude are an alternative way that returns us to a more communal way of coping. Gratitude is acknowledging that you're not on your own. Humility brings you back into the arms of the crowd. As Dan says, we hold each other up.
Yeah, I like that. We hold each other up. It's a great idea. Our culture has this alternative way already in it, this more communal way of defending against death anxiety. It may be in the form of ideas from other cultures, or it may be ideas from our own culture from hundreds of years ago. Self-aggrandizement, pushing individualistic achievement, is really reaching a dead end. Knowing, loving, and serving other people, being part of a larger whole, may be a better way to live a good life. Steve, a lot of wonderful and important ideas.
A lot of important ideas in our first year, that's for sure.
And we're not done yet, my friend. It's been a real pleasure working on this with you.
Same. Hey, great first year.
Yes, sir.
So, folks, join us next time. Like us on Facebook. We are grateful for your encouragement. Please recommend us to your friends. You can find us at www.thehubforimportantideas.com.
And support us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/thehubimportantideas. We are 100% listener supported, and we are most grateful to you for your support.
Thank you for listening to The Hub for Important Ideas. I'm Steve James.
And I'm Ken Swain. Stay safe, everybody.
And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.